Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Matt Singer from Screencrush is here today. Listen, he's a big deal. He just wrote this fantastic book on Siskel and Ebert called Opposable Thumbs. We covered so much ground. I'm not belaboring the point. I'm just going to shut up. Let's hear from Matt. And here we are with Matt Singer and his book, Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever. Matt, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. Let's talk.
Yeah, Matt, first question. All right, you're editor-in-chief and critic at Screencrush. Very active on Twitter. And I mean, editor-in-chief, but also you're writing articles kind of constantly. And I should point out, too, you are one of the few people on Earth. I messaged you on Twitter. No, I'm not going to call it X. Messaged you, just said, hey, love the book. If I could talk to you, that'd be great. You got back to me within 10 minutes. Did you figure out how to put together a 30-hour workday or something? Like, how do you keep up with all this?
Well, I mean, what you're describing is a day where I spend too much. You already said I spend too much time on Twitter and all that. So, I mean, these things come in. I see them very quickly usually. So it's not so much a 30-hour day, although I have long days sometimes. It's more just I do spend a lot of my time just sitting at my desk or somewhere in my house just writing. And so I happen to see these things. Actually, the people involved with the book, like at the publisher and stuff, have joked to me about how fast I respond to their emails. But that's just because I'm sitting here, man. I'm just here. This is what I'm doing. I'm consumed by this computer. Sadly, it's like the closest relationship in my life right now. So, yeah, I just happen to see these things.
Let's jump to the book, because, I mean, this was just pure nostalgia for me. It's about Siskel and Ebert. What made you write this book? What made you say, this needs to be written, this story needs to be told?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of sort of different reasons, but when you say it was pure nostalgia for you, I mean, that's kind of what it was for me too. You know, I grew up a huge Siskel and Ebert fan. And one of the reasons to write it was I really wanted to read it. Like, I kind of could not believe that there wasn't a Siskel and Ebert book. And there's lots of articles and there was an oral history and there's been all these different things, but there wasn't like a definitive book that I would have liked to read. And so well, if nobody else has done it, I'm going to do it. That was one. And then the sort of the other big thing was that, I wanted to write something. I've written a couple of books and I was looking for a subject, and this was sort of in the mix. And it's really my wife who gets the credit for really pushing me to do it, because I was sort of weighing a couple of different things and I wasn't sure. And I showed her some of the things I was thinking about. And actually, like, Siskel and Ebert either wasn't on, I don't think it even was on the list at all, actually. And I think she was the one, she looked at it and she's like, why isn't Siskel and Ebert one of these options? Because she knows me and how pathetic and obsessive I am about that and how much I loved it. And I was like, and it was mostly just I was intimidated, like writing about this thing that means so much to you, and, grew up idolizing these people and also their writers. So now my writing is going to be compared to their writing, and that's a losing game, man. That's a dangerous one for me. I'm not so egotistical to think that I can rate with that stuff. So that was all sort of giving me pause, let's say. And my wife was just like, of course, she was like, you're good, you can do it, all the things she's supposed to say. But she's like, well, if you don't do it and someone else does, you're going to be furious. You're going to be so angry. And I was like, damn it, she's right. Damn it. So that was it. And that really got the ball rolling. And several years later, here we are talking about it.
Now, I have to say, I love the whole book, but the most important thing for me is you gave me huge validation, because I think back to kind of this time period, and I remember when I saw them on TV, whatever the name of the show was, and we'll get into that, I always remember if they were on, I was glued to the TV. Like, I always loved this, the way they talked about stuff. Like, I felt like it was making you smarter, and they were kind of smart asses themselves sometimes, which, seeing adults. But I always thought back and I said, when I watched The Simpsons, it was Sunday night at 8. I knew where my ass was going to be because I was watching The Simpsons Sunday night at 8. And as I'm reading this book, I'm like, why didn't I watch this more religiously when I loved it so much? And you talk about it. It had 4 different names. You never knew when it was going to be on. That validation was great, but I guess my question is, do you remember the first time you saw them? I remember the first time I saw the show, it was when they had the blue background. They're in the balcony and it's the blue background. So I don't know if that was the at the movies version or whatever. Do you remember the first time you saw them?
The honest answer is I actually don't remember the first time. I don't know. Like, it wasn't like I was sitting and found them reviewing, Full Metal Jacket and was like, wow, this is amazing. I wish I had a great, juicy first time story. What I remember is just, by the time I was about 13, it really was kind of an obsession, and I love The Simpsons too. We're probably about the same age. It was in there with the mix of shows that I was obsessed with at that age were really like Seinfeld was really number one, and The Simpsons and Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Siskel and Ebert. Those were like not the holy quadrilogy or whatever you want to call it. Like those were the shows. And as you say, and I do write about it in the book, like it was a hard show to watch at times because it was a syndicated, by this point, which we're talking about the early 90s, it was a syndicated show. They had started on PBS, local PBS in Chicago. But then after a few years, they moved into syndication. And by the early 90s, that's still where they were. But a syndicated TV show, I think for a lot of people, syndicated TV show now might mean, I don't even know if it means anything, but if it means anything, it's probably like a daytime talk show, like the Drew Barrymore show or Ellen or something like that, where it's on every day, 5 times a week, and it's reliable. Like, I guess that's all that's really left of syndication. It's a different world now. But for them, it was just a show that was available to local networks, and they could program it pretty much whenever they wanted. And so what happened was it was on at weird times and it would change. Sometimes you would tune in one week. Yeah. And you would just, you would tune in at the usual time and it wouldn't be on. And you would go, why are they showing an infomercial for Ron Popeil? Where are Siskel and Ebert? What happened? It's definitely like pre-useful internet. Like the internet exists. You can probably, if you have a modem in your house, you can probably dial up and like look at a message board maybe. Or like you could load like a website that has like, Star Trek news on it, but it takes 45 minutes to load the homepage. Like it's another world. So it's very hard to even figure out when it's going to be on. You get used to one time, you plan it out, and then you show up and it's not there. So yeah, that was a constant struggle, along with the fact that it was often on late at night. So if you were a fan like we were, and you were, weren't old enough or to be allowed to stay up till 11, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning to watch 2 guys from Chicago newspapers talk about movies, then it got really dicey. Yeah. So it was to love this show, especially back then. You really had to show, you had to prove that you loved it. You had to earn it because it was not easy to watch.
I'm getting flashbacks just as you're talking because I grew up just outside of New York City in Rockland County. I remember PBS was channel 13. And I'm starting to think, I think the only times I saw it was my father let me stay up on Saturday nights until midnight because that's when American Gladiators came on, which was like our show.
Right. Another good show. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I remember it was, you just never knew. And then all of a sudden it would be a Thursday night at 7 p.m. and you're just, I'm not going to watch PBS. It's PBS. And you're like, oh, there it is. Now there's my next 30 minutes. It's gone. I also remember, and this just, maybe I'm just a narcissist, but whenever I watched their reviews, if they didn't agree with me on a movie, it felt like personal. Like it hurt my feelings if they didn't love, like I was watching a couple today before this. They didn't love Spaceballs as much as I love Spaceballs, and I take it personal. How about you? What do you think?
I probably did. I can't think of an example, but certainly watching that show, until I watched it, I had no concept of what film criticism was. And so, yeah, it was one of the appeals of the show over time was learning about, oh, it's not just that everyone loves movie X or movie Y. Like there can be difference of opinion about it, right? And they certainly were not monolithic. They weren't always going to love something or hate something as one. I mean, that was a huge appeal of the show, was they're arguing about things. I guess maybe sometimes I would have taken it personally. Like I'm guessing, although I don't have a specific memory, like I'm sure, because another thing I was very, very big fan of at the time would, let's say, like Jim Carrey movies of this period. I was a big, Ace Ventura, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber. I saw them all. I thought he was, a comic genius, the likes of which our world had never seen before. And they were not too kind to a lot of those movies. I think Dumb and Dumber got 1 thumb up. The Mask, I think, got 2 thumbs down, but maybe they were a little kinder to that. And I know they hated Ace Ventura, a movie I must have seen 6,000 times between the ages of like 13 and 15. So I probably was, I'm sure I would get a little indignant and huffy. But I sort of enjoyed it more for like when they would talk about a movie I had never even heard of, because, you know, I grew up in suburban New Jersey. And so like my knowledge of movies was really limited to like, what are they showing at my local multiplex? And what are the commercials on television that are airing? Because this is, again, pre-internet, basically, certainly pre-YouTube, pre-being able to just watch trailers, and there's no movie blogs or anything like that. So it's pretty much like, well, what are they advertising on TV, and what's playing at the Freehold Lowe's Metroplex, which is going to just be the big stuff. So I would get excited when they would talk about these like more, you know, like I remember like when they reviewed Train Spotting and being like, oh, this looks really cool. And then I found a theater that showed it that summer, and it completely blew my mind. And like that same summer, I remember seeing Lone Star, the John Sayles film. And that was another movie that they reviewed very positively. And so I'm like using them as sort of my, what should I watch? And I didn't always agree with them, but it was a great way to discover these things. And then you see these movies and you're like, holy cow, these actually are really good. And it was absolutely the gateway to learning more about movies, learning more about criticism, all that sort of stuff.
Now, were you always so much of a film nut that you were going to see stuff no matter what? You were just going to constantly be there? Because, I mean, especially for people, you know, a bit younger than us, we're probably that on the younger spectrum, right? A thumbs up or thumbs down, right? Kids say they hang up the telephone. They don't know why that term exists. And even today, 2 thumbs up means something when somebody says it. For you, obviously a film nut, were you going to go watch stuff no matter what? Or did their 2 thumbs up or 2 thumbs down make you more likely or less likely to go?
Certainly, like that story I was just, you know, telling you, like, oh, for sure, it made me much more likely to put something on my radar. I mean, at this age, what we're talking about still, you know, like early to mid 90s, you know, I loved movies, but I was not like, you know, from the age of 5 watching, you know, Fellini and Renoir and Kurosawa and all these sorts of things. Like I was watching Spaceballs and Ghostbusters, and I didn't have the broadest tastes, and I certainly didn't have this expansive film knowledge or anything like that. And honestly, a lot of that period, like what I was most interested in were comic books, and movies were kind of in a way secondary. You know, Batman, we had Batman and then Batman Returns. But like this is another world that we're talking about where there were not 17 superhero movies a year. It was, you know, most of what we got, it was horrible. They were just terrible. And so if you liked that sort of genre, you really had to read comics. That's where the good stuff still was. So yeah, movies were kind of like, it was more like 1A, 1B to me. And then this show and becoming really obsessed with it was really how I discovered how exciting movies could be. And yeah, when they said 2 thumbs up, I certainly was paying attention, especially at that time, you know, and when, you know, now if it was something that I was going to see anyway and they didn't like it or whatever, I might go see it anyway. But again, like when they were recommending like an indie movie that I hadn't heard of before, you know, when they're saying, you know, you should go see this Lone Star movie or something like that, I took that seriously. And sometimes they weren't easy to see because these movies didn't play that much by me. But if I could, or if it, like I would keep it in mind, and then when it would come out on home video, you know, when I would go to the video store and you could rent it there, I would rent almost everything I rented was based on the new movies they recommended. And then also, you know, one of the segments that was a feature during this period on the show was the video pick of the week, brought to you by Orville Redenbacher. That's good popcorn, or whatever they said. And so they would recommend classics there. And I watched a lot of movies after seeing them talk about it on the show. You know, that is where I found some of those old great masters and watched their movies for the first time.
And the first couple chapters is just their early childhoods. It must have been pretty gratifying for you, right? Because like you just said, you didn't grow up saying, I'm going to be, you know, a film critic or anything like that, but neither did they, right? Like they both come from, you know, similar and not similar backgrounds, but just like you, it was kind of not fell into it, but it wasn't the plan from day one, right?
No, that's absolutely true. No, neither one dreamed of being someday, mom and dad, I will be a film critic. That was definitely not either of their ambitions. Roger was writing at the Sun-Times and the film critic retired. And he was young and he had written about movies like in columns, and he'd done like some junkets and filed reports and stuff. And one of the local film publicists in town said, you should give the job to Ebert. He's good. And that was it. He was the film critic for the next 40 odd years until he passed away at the Sun-Times. Siskel was a little more active about it. He sought the job out, but it was a similar situation where he was working at the Tribune. He was a reporter. And in that case, the critic left. And it wasn't even like permanently leaving. He only left for like a fellowship at Harvard for a year. And the paper was just going to, kind of have people sub in here and there. Whenever there's a movie, we need someone to write it, someone will cover it. And he got it in his head that he should have the job. And he wrote a letter to his boss or whoever was in charge of the art section and said, your idea of just replacing the guy who's leaving with a bunch of people, whoever, can fill in, is a bad one. We'd be missing out. If we don't have one critic who's covering all these movies, we will be, poorer for it as a newspaper. And by the way, you should give the job to me. And he slipped the letter under the editor's door thinking, well, I gave it a shot, and the next day when he came in, supposedly they gave him the job. And that was it. That was how he got the job. And neither one had any formal training in film. They didn't study film in college. When they went to school, there really wasn't much in the way of film studies. That wasn't really a thing. Certainly at that academic level, there's very few places at that time where you could get a degree in film studies. So yeah, they just loved movies and were passionate about it and kind of learned on the job in a lot of ways.
Listen, we don't have enough time. You do a full analysis in the book about this, but I think a lot of people oversimplify the relationship and say they hated each other. And I think you dig in and you show that that's not necessarily the case. But they both were prickly, especially with each other. More from a summary perspective, do you think that they had problems getting along because they just looked at things differently, or was it all down to just straight ego or competitiveness?
Can the answer be C, all of the above?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think you described a lot of the reasons that they did have as you put it, a prickly relationship. I do think they both had pretty big egos. I think they both thought they didn't need each other to be film critics, which, at their newspapers, they certainly did not. They were very successful before they ever, started doing the show. Ebert had already won the Pulitzer Prize by the time the show was first on the air.
And never let Siskel forget it.
That's right. And Siskel was not too pleased about that. So, yeah, I mean, they would often say that their relationship was like sibling rivalry, that they would, see, I have a brother. It's his birthday today, as a matter of fact, as we're recording this.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Doug. I love my brother, but we don't always get along 100%. Sometimes you fight, And I have two daughters now, and they're closer in age than my brother and I are. And I see them, and at times it's very Siskel and Ebert-esque, the way that they relate to each other. They love each other, and at times they can really get along. And when they are working together, they are a force to be reckoned with. But they also, there are times when they just can't stand each other, and and they will fight and they will go tooth and nail. So yeah, I think that's a pretty fair description of how G and Roger were as well.
What I found really interesting, kind of the inside baseball that you had on this, you go into how they had clips and how they'd pull in the clips and everything like that. And it's just, especially the strike, just ended for the writers and everything like that. And I just kept thinking about how stuff like this kind of keeps happening, where they would do their own clips, and then a lot of these distributors would start saying, hey, you know what, we're just going to give you the clips we want you to show, to almost kind of push them to be more positive about these movies. And I couldn't help but thinking, as I'm reading this book, like, these are not the two guys you want to try and strong arm, because their competitiveness and, listen, their egos, right? They're just not going to stand for that. And you're just antagonizing guys who would rather burn down the movie theater than be forced to do something they don't want to do. Did you know kind of about that stuff ahead of time, or was that all in research?
I knew a little about the process of making the show, but what I didn't really understand fully was just how much work went into getting those clips. So, if you think of, if people are listening and they've seen the show, haven't seen the show, they're reviewing a movie and they'll throw 2 clips from the movie, sometimes little bits from the trailer, but usually it's like scenes, and they cue up what they're, here's a scene with this, or, like Tom Hanks gives a great performance in this scene, and then they'll play the scene. Well, nowadays, every big movie that comes out from a Hollywood studio, like they all have what's called an electronic press kit, an EPK, and that has clips in it. And it's the clips that the studios want people on TV or on YouTube, whatever, who are going to show parts of the movie. This is what they want their customers to see. They're curating those clips to make the movie look as good as possible, which, I mean, that's their job. I get it. They want people to buy tickets. This is part of the game, right? But at the time, Siskel and Ebert, or sneak previews, or whatever it was called at that exact time in the mid 1970s, when that started, that wasn't really a thing. And so one of the innovations of the show in those early days was that they had clips. And to get them, because EPKs did not exist for the most part, they would go, and in a process that's kind of mind-boggling when you hear it laid out. Someone from the show would go with Gene and Roger to the press screening. They would sit there with them. When there was a scene that Gene and or Roger wanted to talk about on the show, they would yell out, "This scene." The producer, whoever's from the show, would be there with like a stopwatch or their watch. They would be timing the movie to write down the times, because they would then have to take the sections of the movie. And this is, again, the mid 1970s. Movies are not projected digitally. They are projected on film, giant reels of 35 millimeter film. The movies are sent via these huge cans, multiple cans, like there'd be 5 or 6 of them would be a whole movie. So they'd only take the parts of the movie that they wanted, that Gene and Roger wanted to talk about. They take those cans full of film, bring them to a transfer house in Chicago, copy just those scenes, and then have to bring them back. If you know anything about how movies are marketed now and these studios, it is inconceivable that they would be like, yes, you can take our movie, take the physical print of our film that we are showing to critics, or even in a movie theater to the people, and you can copy parts of it, whatever part you want to show, and then put it on your show where you can put them in any context you want, talk about them however you want, say they're good or bad. This would never happen today, but it did happen, especially in the early years of the show. And that was a huge appeal of the show, because people in this pre-internet age who are looking for information about movies, this is where they could go, and they could say, oh, there is a new, there's a new Charlton Heston film. Let's watch sneak previews. Let's see what it looks like. Let's see what they say, but let's also watch, because they would show, the reviews at that time would be 7-8 minutes long, and there might be 2 or 3 minutes worth of full clips, full scenes. So you could really get a taste of the show. So yeah, it was a huge asset to the show in those days. And they were not always happy about the fact that later on it became a little more kind of regimented, and they would kind of have to use the clips that were provided to them. And sometimes they would try to push back on it, like even after that whole process that I described went away, Gene would say on the show, they wouldn't send us any of the clips we wanted for this movie. They would only show us the trailer, or they wouldn't let us show anything from the movie. Let that tell you how bad the movie is. If they had any faith in their movie, they would let us show you some of it. Like they would call the movies, the filmmakers, the studios out. So to your point about 100 years ago, while I've been rambling on, yes, they were not to be trifled with. And they were unafraid to speak their minds about anything in the world of movies. They were just merciless and honest, and that absolutely was a huge part of their appeal.
That entire process you just talked about is making me feel so bad for anyone who would have been an assistant for this show. Because, we talk about Siskel and Ebert going at each other, but listen, let's be honest. They were geniuses in a lot of ways, but they were also huge divas. They weren't just fighting with each other, anybody that was around, if they were having a bad day. And I'm just imagining an assistant that wrote down the wrong scene and wrote the wrong one. Oh, it's going to be a rough day. Rough day at the office for him.
Yeah, probably not a good day at the office, yes. I do think they were the hardest on each other, especially in those early years. It seems like there could be a lot of tension on that set and just a lot of yelling and screaming and frustration. So yeah, it wasn't the happiest place to work early on, I would say. Over time, I think it got a lot better. And look, I didn't interview people who were like, they were horrible, they were monsters. everyone I spoke to kind of had the opposite. They were like, yeah, they could be a handful sometimes, but we loved working there. We loved making the show. And even though they could be a pain in the tuchus sometimes, they were lovely guys also, and they were incredibly generous. And, I heard these stories that I had never heard before about these amazingly generous things Gene would do for people who worked on the show, or even just like people who worked around the studio, like buying people things that needed, you would hear the receptionist at the TV studio needed new glasses and couldn't afford them. And then he would buy them for her. That was the kind of things he would do like all the time. So they were complicated guys. They were not, they weren't perfect, but none of us are. Again, part of what made the show special, especially at this time when reality television really does not exist, is they were real on television. Like what you saw was what you got. They were as real and as authentic as you could imagine as they presented themselves on TV. And, in a different context, maybe that would have been bad because they were not very good actors. And also when they were pissed off, they couldn't fake it. It was very clear. But on their show, being pissed off was sometimes a good thing, because when you're talking about crappy movies, if you're in a jovial mood, that doesn't work as well as being angry. Sometimes that energy is exactly what that show needed.
Now, it seems like they always kind of respected each other in the background, even though they may not say that out loud. Do you think it was something that they just needed to be around each other long enough to really start to, kind of love each other the way that they ended up being towards the end? Do you think it was just a matter of time? Or do you think that was always going to be there? They just always needed to test each other to kind of get to what they wanted to get to?
Again, it's sort of, there might be a combination of elements. Certainly they were together a very long time, decades of working together. I mean, if you hate each other that intensely as they did in the very beginning, like it wouldn't have lasted. You know what I mean? They had to be able to work together for it to go on that long. In all honesty, I think the fact that the show became so successful certainly didn't hurt. If you can't stand working with someone and you're not making much money and nobody cares, and it's like, what am I doing this for? But, within a year or two, like the show started to take off. Then they go into syndication where they're making a ton of money. They jump again into another syndicator and make even more money. And, on top of their gigs doing everything else they're doing, like it's a pretty cushy job they had, and all they needed to do was kind of like each other enough to get along enough to do the show. So I think that helped also, would they have stayed for 20 something years just at PBS? That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe eventually they might have gotten sick of each other, but that's not what happened. What happened was they did become quite good at what they did. And as you said, and I agree with you, they were incredibly competitive and also very driven to succeed. And they could both see that they had a good thing going, and it just kept getting better and better. And they were doing better and better. The show would do better and better. And so I think that helps improve a relationship, where all of a sudden when you're succeeding together, and they absolutely were, that probably smooths over a few bumps in the road, I would think.
And now there's a ton of other details in the book. I don't want to give too much away because I want people to read it. So I want to go into a few what ifs with you. I'm going to give you some really rough ones. So I just want you to be prepared. First one, Sophie's Choice. Unfortunately, right, both of them are gone. I can bring one of them back for an hour for you to talk to, ask questions for 1 hour. Siskel or Ebert?
This is a very brutal question. I would love to talk to both of them, but I guess if I only could pick one, I would probably pick Gene for the reason that I was fortunate enough to meet Roger a few times. I worked with him a little bit. I exchanged emails with him on many occasions. I'm not going to sit here and pretend we were buddies, but I did get to speak with him and interact with him and know him a little bit. I never got to do any of that with Gene ever. Gene passed away. He was very, very young. He passed away in 1999. In the early 1999, I was still in college. And he was also just a very private person as well, and he didn't leave behind a great memoir the way Ebert did. I could summon questions for both of them to go on for days, but I could really summon some questions to ask Gene. So I guess that would be my choice of this impossible theoretical choice.
They get easier from here. That was the rough one. By the way, my answer, just because, it's my podcast, I'm allowed to do it. I would go with Ebert. I just always felt like if you got Ebert into a bar, I feel like he'd tell the better stories. Like you're saying, with Siskel, I think he'd be a bit quieter. I think Ebert's going to have everybody wrapped around his finger telling stories, but that's just my thought process on that one. Next up, okay, 1 or 2 movies that have come out since they both passed that you wish you could see them review.
Oh man, I got to try to think of some. I mean, there's so many, but I mean, that is for sure something that I've thought a lot, especially in like the decade or so since Roger passed away, because, even after Gene passed away, Roger was still with us for quite a few more years. And all through that period was when his work was available on the internet. And so as much as I loved Siskel and Ebert, I really loved reading Roger's articles, reviews, books. I have a whole shelf in my house of Ebert books. The Great Movie series was huge for me in college, reading those essays and then seeing the movies he was writing about, just amazing. I would often, find myself thinking, God, I would have loved to have read Roger's review about movie X. But now I have to sit here and think of a specific example.
This is one I'm thinking about when I thought of this question. Just because, it's not hoity-toity or anything like that, but I think about something that's like a popcorn movie that people are like, it's a good movie by itself. And what I kind of keep coming back to is Captain America: Winter Soldier. A lot of people say that's one of the better Marvel movies, and that, like, even if you're not a comic book fan, I would be interested just to see what they would look at. What they look at and they say, this is derivative or something else, or, hey, this is just a lot of fun and this is cool, but this is kind of weak. Stuff like that is kind of what jumps in my head when I think about it.
That's a good one. I feel like for me, the first movie that's coming to mind right now, which I don't even know if I thought this at the time, but, I'm trying to think of things that didn't have a critical consensus, that were divisive and polarizing. And I would want to know which side of the debate they would fall on. And the movie that came to mind just now is the movie Babylon by Damien Chazelle, which came out, I guess, was it late last year, I want to say? Not a movie that I particularly loved myself personally, but I know people who found a lot that they really admired in that movie. And then I know other people who hated it even more than I did. So I would be very interested to hear like where they fell on a movie like that. And if one liked it and one didn't, which is possible, they probably could have had a very fun debate and argument about that movie, because I had some very enjoyable discussions about that movie with my friends and with colleagues and stuff, because yeah, that wasn't a movie where everyone walked out of it saying, wow, it's one of the best movies of the year. It was more like some people walked out saying, well, that was something. And other people were like, that was not something, that was garbage. And then there was, and then people would be, bouncing it around.
And also, I mean, especially like stuff that, you write up now and what they wrote up too. I'm not necessarily a movie intellectual, right? For instance, I can enjoy a Transformers movie. If Optimus Prime punches Megatron, I can have a good time. I'm not too worried about the plot. But something like the new All Quiet on the Western Front that just came out, that would be something that I'd love to see them review, because they'd be able to do kind of that intellectual breakdown of what did this look like before? How was it changed? How did they enhance it? Are they going to be on the same page as everybody else and say, I loved it. I know a ton of people loved it. To have somebody who really has that kind of background to look at it and say, is this as good as everybody thinks it is?
Yeah, and they were really great at doing both of those things. Like they would have had great and interesting reviews probably about both of those kinds of movies that you mentioned. They could talk in a very serious way about silly movies if they thought that they were worthy of that sort of discussion. If they found something in a quote unquote frivolous movie or a popcorn movie that they thought was, really interesting and perhaps was buried there somewhere in the subtext, they would talk about that. Or they might just say, this is a very enjoyable popcorn movie. And on the other hand, they could dive into some of the more nuances. And, they talked a lot about art house films, independent films, foreign films. Like we've already talked about. That was how I discovered a lot of those sorts of movies for the first time myself. They would sometimes do whole episodes about a director or a movement in cinema or an issue in cinema. I used to love those too, like when they would talk for 30 minutes about why black and white movies are good. Like that was certainly eye-opening at the time for a kid like me. So yeah, I think they were very versatile film critics, which was again part of their appeal. And they had a way of talking about even so-called highfalutin, artsy-fartsy movies in a way that was very approachable. And they never made you feel like you were bad or a bad film lover. If you hadn't ever seen a Kurosawa film before, if you didn't know who made 8.5, or, if you thought the rules of the game was probably something about Monopoly or something, like, it wasn't that sort of vibe. The show was about welcoming you into this world of movies, and isn't it an amazing place to be? And they really made you think that, well, I could be a part of this. And, my opinion is valuable too, because you have to remember the show is not just, as much as people love the 2 thumbs up, or at least as much as movie studios and their marketing teams love 2 thumbs up, the show wasn't about, here is the objective truth of this movie. The show was about, here are 2 subjective opinions of this movie, and they may conflict. They may be totally different, and they often were. They would sometimes see totally different things about the same movie. Sometimes they would agree that a movie was good and totally disagree about why it was good. You know what I mean? There was no simple, objective, this is how it's supposed to be. And I certainly was not cognizant of this as a kid watching the show. I think it really instilled that sort of welcoming, what you have to say is valuable, what you think is valuable, kind of democratized sort of idea of film criticism, which I think is really fantastic. And I know from personal experience, from talking to other colleagues, from talking to just random people, that it was that for a lot of people. It was their gateway to discovering movies, discovering film criticism, and thinking seriously about all of these things as well.
And now, film critic yourself, you would segue perfectly into the next question, which was, is there anything that you consciously took from them growing up, right? So number one, hey, really don't talk down to people. This is your opinion, and everybody can have an opinion and they can all be right. Is there anything else that as a critic you can look back and say, I learned this from them and I still make sure to think about these things when I put together a review?
I'm not sure there's any specific things that I'm cognizant of so much as it is probably everything that I do is somehow filtered down, even subliminally, from watching the show, reading especially Roger's reviews, because Gene's reviews are a little harder to find online even today. There isn't a central, there is a RogerEbert.com where, if you would like to, and I would encourage you, if you are interested, you could read almost every film review he ever wrote. They're all archived on that wonderful website. There isn't a GeneSiskel.com like that. I think there is a website, but it isn't an archive of his writing. I wish there was. If there was, I would be the first person to, subscribe to its Substack or whatever it would be. I'm sure if you went and found the earliest horrible pieces of film criticism I wrote, they were just shamelessly ripped off from Roger Ebert. I don't have any examples, but I'm sure if you found these horrible things, these unreadable texts, I can guarantee you they would be a bad Ebert impression, because that's what I was reading, that's what I loved, and that's what I was really sort of ingesting all of that from. In terms of specifics, I mean, both of them, they were both newspaper critics turned TV critics, but they did kind of have separate perspectives about how to do their jobs. They wrote very differently, especially, on television. The constraints of the format sort of made them maybe give reviews that were perhaps more similar than they would have been otherwise. In print, like Siskel always said, he looked at his job like, I'm a reporter and my beat is, movies. He would call movies the national dream beat. And he would say, I look at this as if I am going to a fire, but instead of a fire, I'm seeing 3 ninjas kick back. And I'm reporting on what happened at the fire, aka 3 ninjas kick back. And I'm giving you what happened and also what happened to me, right? And Ebert didn't necessarily disagree with that, but he would often, he would say things like, I see myself as a teacher. And I am trying to educate you about the movie and what's in there. And, he would sort of approach it from perhaps a little bit more of a perspective of his famous line was always, it's not what the movie is about, it's how it is about it. And so that's what he was sort of writing about, was really the how. Three Ninjas Kick Back. Okay, well, is this a good movie about three child ninjas? He would say, theoretically, you could make a good movie about three child ninjas. Is this that good movie? It may not be, or it may be. Perhaps it is. And that is a lovely way to approach it. And I guess although I don't necessarily consciously think of that, I certainly agree with that approach. And I would hope that it kind of comes through in the stuff that I write as well.
For the record, Three Ninjas Kick Back was terrible. I'm going, that's mine. That's
for some reason, I reached into my brain and that was the movie that came out. I can't tell you why. I don't know why, but out of all the films in all the world, the one that came out was the immortal classic, Three Ninjas Kick Back.
Oh, you're killing me, Matt. All right, 2 more questions, but they might be the most important ones. Number 1. Are you preemptively telling everyone that they need to see the new Jason Statham movie, The Beekeeper, based purely on seeing the trailer?
Well, you should never do that, but yes, I am, for sure, yeah. As we're recording this, the trailer just came out today, and it looks unbelievable. It looks like a fake movie that would appear like in a trailer. The trailer would appear in the front of a comedy, like a Kentucky Fried Movie or something that compiles fake movie trailers, because it does not look real. But apparently it is, and Jason Statham plays a beekeeper who fights crime.
Sure, why not?
And I'm sure his name is like Benjamin Keeper or something. I can't wait. Yeah, it looks tremendous.
I'm going to go on Fandango right after this. I'm telling you right now. All right, last question for you, Matt. One of the reasons we have History Nerds United, right, is nonfiction. And I'm saying this is history, right? This is movie history, the way this is done. A lot of people will look at a book and say, like, I don't read history. I don't read nonfiction. It's boring, right? If I put one of those people and sat them in front of you and they said, hey, why should I read Opposable Thumbs? What would you say?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's about movies. We're not talking about the history of some arcane subject like, I don't know, medieval poetry of centuries ago. We're talking about, the recent past, and we're talking about the history of movies. I put this in the book somewhere. There's that famous expression, journalism is the first draft of history. And to me, one of the things I love about Siskel and Ebert is it's kind of like the first draft of film history of the period that the show was on, from 1975 to 1999. And then there are the versions, without Gene after that. But for that period, if you love movies, if you are interested in movies, and by extension, if you are interested in our country and popular culture and social tastes and evolving ideas about certain subjects, you could get a pretty good sense of what was going on in the world at that time by watching old Siskel and Eberts. And by extension, hopefully, you can get a taste of all of that in the book. For me, as someone who was a fan, going back and rewatching all these shows, that was one of the things that I really enjoyed, beyond just the simple pleasure of always loved the show, and I always enjoyed listening to Gene and Roger talk and review and debate and argue and all that jazz. Like, when you watch hundreds of them over a period of months, as I did, you really see like the world evolve around them, their fashions change, what they're wearing changes, the sorts of movies they're talking about changes. When the show started, VHS did not exist, at least as a widely available commercial product. And you get to watch them wrestle with that. At first, they're like, oh, we don't own VCRs. Movies should be seen in a movie theater, which is an argument that still seems interesting and relevant today to our current times. And then like a year later, they do episodes about VHS tapes that are popular in video stores. And lo and behold, they both love VHS now because they realize actually a lot of older movies are available on VHS and people are discovering classic films on VHS. And actually, VHS is one of the great things that ever happened to, cinephilia and love of movies. And then a few years later, DVD comes along and there's all these different things that you can learn about, chart, watch, rise and fall, their evolution, just by watching Siskel and Ebert and hopefully reading my book. On top of that, just a lot of really good stories in there too. Like if you enjoy the behind the scenes stories of how the nuts and bolts of TV is made and how stars are managed.
Don't forget the pranks. There are definitely pranks.
There are pranks. There are pranks that I don't think would fly today. I think the HR department would have to get involved in some of these pranks. If you either love Siskel and Ebert or have no idea who they are, this book is perfect for you, really.
I guarantee you your publicist is going to love that answer because it's literally everyone on the face of the earth.
Literally everyone on the planet. But seriously, everyone would love it. It's perfect. It's a great book.
It's a fantastic book. I loved it. Matt, thank you so much for coming on. This was great.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
And that's it for this episode. Matt, thank you so much for coming on. Opposable Thumbs. Go out and get it, everybody. Even if you didn't know who Siskel and Ebert were, trust me, there is something cool in this book for you. It just covers a lot. I loved it. Go out and get it. In the meantime, hit us up Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And yes, I said Twitter. I'm not saying X. Okay. Leave us comments. Leave us reviews, 5 stars, please. You can even type a nice comment in there, depending on what you're listening on. And listen, we want to hear from you. Till next time, nerds. Stay cool.